My name is Tanya Johnson Martin. I'm a 27-year seasoned educator who is currently a middle school reading specialist in Howard County, Maryland. In addition, I'm a proud director for both the Maryland State Education Association and the National Education Association. I'm so happy and honored to be with you with this amazing and talented group of authors for this first ever young adult author chat in celebration of Read Across America. We so appreciate them and you for making time to gather and talk about diverse books. Since the very first celebration in 1998, NEA's Read Across America has generated enthusiasm for reading nationwide, raised public awareness for children's literacy, and supported educators, parents, and others in their ongoing efforts to motivate kids to read. NEA's Read Across America is an incredible vehicle for focusing attention on the literacy needs and successes of our children and drives home the message that reading is important and fun. But NEA's 3 million members who work at every level of education, from preschool to university grad programs, know it takes much more than a one-day celebration. Now, as a year-long program, Read Across America is just not a day to celebrate reading. It's a way of thinking, reading, and sharing diverse books throughout the year that, as author and educator Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop phrased, provide windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors to readers. With so many challenges to books across the country and efforts by state legislators to censor classroom speech, it is more important than ever to connect kids to stories that offer different perspectives and help them to see how others think and feel. In my own work as a middle school reading specialist, I've seen the positive impact that providing students with diverse texts has had on my students. The idea of why providing book choices that represent the richness of students' lives is important and can offer some inspiration and new ideas that engage teen readers. We will be discussing that later on with our panelists. I have some questions that I want to ask, and we're also going to monitor the comments for other questions. To get things started, I'm going to introduce each of our panelists, and then we'll take a few minutes for each of them to tell us a little about their work. Each of our guest authors has a title that has been recommended by NEA for Read Across America for the 2021-2022 school year, which after I introduce all of them, they will tell us about. Wings of Ebony is the debut fantasy of Elle. Jess is a former educator and first-generation college student with a bachelor's degree in journalism and a master's in educational administration and human development. When she's not writing, Jess can be found mentoring aspiring writers, binging reality TV, loving on her three littles, or cooking up something true to her Louisiana roots. Poet, novelist, and journalist Margarita Engle was born in California to a Cuban mother and American father. A botanist by training, she is the author of many books, including the verse novel With a Star in My Hand, Ruben Darrow, Poetry Hero, and The Surrender Tree, which received a Newbery honor. She is a several-time winner of the Pura Bel Prix and Americas Awards, as well as other prestigious honors. And she served as the 2017-2019 National Young Poet Laureate. Lone Lake holds an MFA degree in fiction from Fairfield University, also her undergraduate alma mater. A Pushcart Prize nominated writer, her short stories have appeared in Craft Literary, Mud Season Review, and Angel City Review. Lone works in book publishing and lives in Manhattan. A Fa Love Story is her first novel. Brittney Morris has an economics degree from Boston University and is the author of The Cost of Knowing, which is her second young adult novel. Her debut young adult novel, Slay, was a Publisher's Weekly Best Book of 2019. She has also written for video games, which she enjoys playing at home in Philly, where she lives with her husband, Stephen, and their tiny bundle of love, Atlas. Authors, let's start talking about your books. Brittney, what can you tell us about The Cost of Knowing?
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. So my sophomore novel, The Cost of Knowing, is about two Black teenage boys who are brothers, and one can see into the future and one can see into the past. And everything changes when the older brother sees a vision of his younger brother dying in the next few days. And so it becomes a race against time to get to the bottom of a 400-year-old family curse and figure out just what it means to be a Black boy in the present. I wrote this novel for all of the Black boys out there who had to grow up too early. It is a novel about family, about brotherhood. It is a celebration of Black masculinity, and I'm really excited to share it with all of you.
Thank you very much. Jess, could you tell us about Wings of Ebony?
Sure. Thanks to some tricky camera work there, I actually have a copy I can show you because it's not this one. This is the sequel. So this is the first one, Wings of Ebony, and then this is book 2. And Wings of Ebony is my debut novel. This is my sophomore novel, which just came out this year. And the duology is about Rue, who is a Black teen from an inner city neighborhood, modeled after the inner city neighborhood of Third Ward that I grew up in Houston. And after her mother's murdered, her estranged father whisks her away to his home, which is an island of magic wielders where no one looks like either of them. They're Rue and her father, the only brown-skinned people on the island. And the story follows Rue's journey as she's trying to get back home, where she feels connected, where she feels rooted, and sort of the desperation to do that, and sort of the choices that she makes to do that, and the snowball of those choices. It's ultimately a story about a Black girl taking back her power and really learning to own her magic. The story follows her as she has to lean into her ancestors' magic to protect her inner city community home from drugs, violence, and crime.
Thank you. Margarita, I would love for you to talk about With a Star in My Hand, Ruben Dario, poetry hero.
Thank you. This is the English edition and Con una estrella en la mano, traducción de Alexis Romay, the Spanish edition. I'm so grateful to have both available. Rubén Darío was the first modernista poet, the first modern poet of Latin America, and he was actually Nicaraguan. I'm Cuban American, and someone might say, why would I write about a Nicaraguan poet? Well, he went to Cuba, and my great grandmother was one of the farm wives who heard him when he went out in the countryside to read his poetry. And from then on, she named 2 of her sons, Ruben and Darío, 2 of my great uncles. She just loved his poetry. At family gatherings, everyone was expected to perform in a poetry out loud style. Ruben Darío poems, nobody else. He was actually very much influenced by the Cuban poet José Martí, but he had a very adventurous life and many difficulties while very young, and a great deal of success while very young. He became known as the boy poet because he was publishing when he was still a child. And then as a teenager, presidents of various Latin American countries would invite him to their country, thinking that he would write poems of praising them. And instead he wrote poems of protest against dictatorships. So he got kicked out of just as many countries as he got invited to. And I find his poems of protest very relevant today.
Thank you. And last but not least, Lone, can you please share a bit about faux love, fa love story?
Yes, of course. So yes, a faux love story is about two teenagers, Bao and Lynn. Their families own these rival pho restaurants, and they've been told their whole entire lives to stay away from each other. But one night, there's this sort of restaurant special going on. Lynn's family is like hosting a special, and it gets really busy, and she's sort of just losing control of it. Bao secretly helps her out during rush hour, and that's sort of the start of their sweet friendship. Lynn is this wonderful artist, but she's not sure how to tell her parents just yet. And Bao, he jokes that he doesn't really know. He jokes that he's okay with being mediocre, but he gradually falls in love with writing. So they sort of have this friendship and then obviously a romance, and they're learning about each other and what they really want, and also figuring out their family secrets that are especially keeping their families apart. So basically this novel is about family, first love, and food, plenty of food, a lot of Vietnamese food, which is important.
All the things that we love, right? Family and food. Okay, so Margarita, you've written several novels in verse, and I've noticed that many more verse novels on bookshelves than ever before. Why should a student reach out for a novel in verse versus a conventional novel? And
You know what?
like about writing verse?
When I started writing verse novels more than 10 years ago, my first one actually came out in 2006, there were very few. And I agree that now there's so many, and it's just wonderful. It's exciting to see how the format has been accepted. I think that a lot of that has to do with people had to get used to the idea of the open spaces. Teachers used to tell me, oh no, poetry's too hard to understand. Reluctant readers won't be able to understand your verse novel. Why don't you write the regular way? And I disagreed with them. Back in 2006, I would go around saying, oh no, look, it's friendly, it's inviting. There's an open space that welcomes a reluctant reader. You can tell a student, this book, you can read this book in 1 hour. And yet it's not a baby book. They're mature young adult novels with some, challenging themes. And so I feel like over time, people have gotten used to the idea that poetry is not hard to understand. I know that my books aren't hard to understand. And I think that this is something left over from when people were in college and they were maybe assigned things and forced to analyze them. So I would ask teachers, instead of ever asking a student, what does the poem mean? Always ask them, how did the poem make you feel? Because in those open spaces, there are the emotions of both the poet and the reader. And those emotions kind of rise up and meet in midair every time there's a pause in the verse. And so I think that can prevent the next generation from developing that fear of poetry. And then it will be a refuge that they can go to, a lifelong source of happiness. When people ask me why I write verse novels instead of prose, it's because poetry makes me happy. And I hope that poetry will make young readers happy too, and that they might even want to write their own verses at some point.
Thank you so much. When you speak of poetry, I'm thinking of college and the Jabberwocky and how we had to analyze, what that meant. But no, I have always been a fan. So on the topic of writing in verse, have any of the other authors thought about writing in verse or are interested in the future in writing in verse?
I can jump in. So poetry was, I don't have any like a published novel in verse, obviously, but poetry was the first type of writing that I like tried to do as a kid. Poetry is just what I connected to because of what Margarita is saying, the emotion in it. I was a very emotional child. I'm still a very emotional adult. And I love it so much. So this is draft 19 of my book. It took a lot of revising. It's the first book I wrote basically, and it just needed a lot of work. And the only thing that is still in here from the original version, the original first draft, is a poem that I wrote. It's in the very back. It's called Afterthoughts. But that's the only piece of the book that remained, was that one little poem. And I realized in hindsight, the first draft, which as we all as writers know is like, it's the first draft. But I realized writing that poem at the end was me emotionally telling the story that I wanted to tell. And then it took me 18 more drafts to flesh out those ideas into a full manuscript. And the poem just kind of stayed at the end. I don't know, it was kind of sentimental. My editor was very kind to let it stay. But yeah, that's the extent of my experience with poetry.
Thank you. Anyone else, Lone or Brittney?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
This is the Zoom dance we have to do. No, you go ahead.
Okay. I never thought I would be writing anything even remotely close to poetry. I always wrote it off as something I would be eternally bad at, which, up for debate. It's poetry. It's open to all sorts of interpretation. But I hit a point while I was writing The Cost of Knowing where the boys had been talking about music, and music came up in the car on the radio. And as I was writing, they both said, oh, I know this song. And I said, oh, this is perfect. This is a moment for them to bond over. And then I was like, oh, great. What if they, start talking about the lyrics? And I'm like, oh, right. Someone's got to write the lyrics. Here we go. And so I was like, I'm writing rap now. This is a surprise. And it was just such a cool experience. I loved writing every single word. And I loved just finding deeper meaning in what they were talking about and having them connect over something that was so deep and personal to both of them. Because a major theme throughout the book is how much they don't think they relate to each other. The younger brother Isaiah stays in his room for most of the first part of the book. Alex, the older brother, is very much absorbed in his own anxiety and depression and just trying to navigate each day and get through it. And so they just assume that they have so little in common. And then when they find this artist with these lyrics that they both know by heart, magic starts to happen. So that was a really defining moment in my writing, and I just might go back to it in future books.
Thank you for sharing. Lone?
Yeah. So Margarita, when you were explaining poetry, you did something like this, and like that's how I feel when I read poetry. And I think I had that mindset when I was younger of poetry being hard and abstract, obscure and stuff. But it wasn't actually in college where I was taught that no, it's about the connection to the page and how you feel when you read it. I had a wonderful poetry professor for one semester, and that just taught me, I think that class taught me a lot about language, how you can say so little but say so much. And that's sort of how why I love poetry, how these two phrases or something, or the way these verses, or sorry, not using a proper term, these lines are laid out. They are there, and your mind is just connecting all of it and creating a whole emotion. Sometimes it's a new emotion, sometimes it's a mix of emotion. So I really just admire poets, and me, I will probably write in my personal journal, never ever sharing poetry, but it does give me a lot of comfort to write poetry too.
Thank you all for such wonderful responses. So Jess, Wings of Ebony introduces readers to a secret world of magical Black people, yet brings to light real world issues. Why did you choose to write fantasy?
I love being asked this question because I know that a lot of readers sometimes see fantasy like students, and it's like, wow, that's a long book. I don't know. I'll just grab a thriller instead. And so I like, taking people and turning them into fantasy readers. That's my secret plan to take over the world. I think that fantasy provides a very protective medium for student readers to engage in, can provide, I should say, engage in more challenging content that might be personally triggering. There's something about reading a fictional reality that feels one step removed from yourself. And I love layering in, since in Wings of Ebony, I do deal with these very sort of, just very big issues. I'm dealing with racism, privilege, allyship. I'm dealing with like the infiltration of drugs in inner city communities. I'm dealing with colonization. I mean, these are heavy topics. I'm dealing with like who writes history, and like having, very like honest moments in the book about that. And that can be a lot, I think, and heavy. And so I thought fantasy gave it this veneer, so that the story feels like it's about something make-believe, so that student doesn't feel like they have to sort of engage with their own trauma to like learn something from the book. They can do it sort of detached from themselves in this make-believe space. I also think a second reason why I picked fantasy in particular for all of my stories is because, since I do write about tougher issues that often don't have a real world resolution, like, we look around and we see racism still today prevalent. And so I'm writing this book, but I don't want it to be heavy unless it is hopeful. Like the heavy and the hope have to be balanced. And one way I do that is by creating this aesthetic of make-believe, because if I don't have to stick to the bounds of like what's reality, if I can fictitiously put magic in your hands, then what I'm saying is you are capable of literally anything you can imagine. Like that's the message there. And so I think that's why I like fantasy. I love, like, literally my favorite genre is thrillers. Don't tell anybody, but I don't write those because they're hard. So I write fantasy because I get to just like frolic in these make-believe places. And I'm hoping to immerse kids and like pull them along on this magical journey and immerse them in this idea that, wow, like I am powerful. Like some of these issues happen in my day-to-day. Like my life isn't magical necessarily, because magic is pretend, but maybe it is magical. Like my dedication in the book is, gosh, it's been a while. Hold on. My dedication in the book is something like, the second book is more at the forefront of my brain these days. It says, and for you, reader, there is an ember in you that is hungry to burn. That is your magic. Let it. And so I want readers to kind of walk away identifying with Rue and feeling like, okay, maybe I can wield a little magic from my hands too, figuratively, maybe I can dream up impossible solutions to things that's even insurmountable. So that's why fantasy.
Thank you so much. And Brittney, The Cost of Knowing also blends the contemporary with fantasy elements, but the magic is is it a burden or a curse? What influenced how you decided to build the world Alex lives in?
Thank you. So when I first came up with the idea for The Cost of Knowing, it was actually born out of writing Slay. So Slay is a celebration of the global Black experience. Whatever your background, whatever country you're from, you are welcome in the Black community, and there is space enough for you. And it largely celebrated, well, people from all backgrounds and people of all genders, but especially Black girls and women. And I really wanted to write a story that celebrated Black men and Black boys. And so what started off as a Black boy joy book starring a boy who worked in an ice cream shop and was happy-go-lucky and wore colorful clothes and danced in the street with his friends and didn't have a care in the world, I got about 20 pages in and said, you know what, this feels tone deaf. It feels like I'm telling a story without acknowledging what a tall order that is to ask of our Black men and boys. To be that character that I was writing, it takes a lot. And so I said, does it take 50,000 words a lot? I think it does. So here we go, writing a book all about what that might look like. And so when I was writing Alex's character, and about him having anxiety and depression like I do, it just felt right to turn it into a story about something more hyperbolic like superpowers, and cross having superpowers with being Black and show what that intersection looks like. So for a lot of people, when they think about seeing into the future or seeing into their past, it might sound kind of cool, might sound kind of interesting. For me as a person with anxiety, hearing that, I'm like, oh, please no. Oh, absolutely not. Anything but that. And so for Alex, the reason why the book is called The Cost of Knowing is because it's about the mental toll that it takes knowing what your future might look like as a Black person in America. We're shown it almost every day on the news when, Black people are killed by the police, when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, when we talk about drugs in schools. All of those things weigh heavy on the minds and hearts of young Black people of all ages, but especially young Black people. And so I just really wanted to write a story that showcased all of that and put that on full display.
Thank you so much. And Lone, I think there aren't enough Vietnamese American stories in young adult literature. What does it mean to you to write about your own culture?
It's something else. I wish there was one word. Maybe it's heartwarming, I guess. Yeah, because when I was younger, there weren't as many books with Vietnamese characters, and I think most of the books were focused on the Vietnam War, which is a huge historic event that is permanently on our brain, in our hearts, obviously. But for me, I was growing up in the aftermath. And there's like a lot to unpack there of being the child of immigrants and being the child of refugees too. So it could be heavy sometimes, but I think because I was so used to seeing Vietnamese culture, Vietnam being associated with the war and the struggles of it, I think it was important for me to show that there's another side too. There's a new generation almost of teenagers who are going to have this opportunity now because of these parents who had come over here, because of they immigrated over here, they escaped war and everything. Because of their struggles, they're going to be able to experience joy. They're going to be able to chase the dreams that they've always wanted to chase. So to put that on page, I just felt, it's so heartwarming, it's so freeing as well, to show that there's so many possibilities for Vietnamese teenagers these days.
Thank you all for sharing. It was interesting today. As I said, I teach middle school, and I was showing my kids, like, look what I'm doing tonight. And they were like, oh, this is cool. Are you famous? I'm like, for an hour. Yes. No, not at all. But they were reading the summaries, so to speak, of each of the books, and I teach a diverse group of students, and I could see them like, oh, I got to write that down. Maybe I can get that book. So I thank you all for what you have put forth, and I try as a middle school reading specialist to definitely present to my students literature that is diverse, where I feel at least one of my students can connect and then feel proud and share with the rest of the group. So thank you for that. So I have a general question, and you can decide who gets to go first. Where did you grow up, and how did your experience storytelling as a child, and how did your childhood inspire your path to becoming a writer?
I can jump in.
Okay.
So my childhood was actually pretty unkind. I was heavily bullied at school, and then my life at home was violent at times. So when my fourth grade teacher assigned us a journal assignment and said, write about what's going on in your day, I looked down at the blank page and went, there is no way I'm writing about what's really going on in my life. I'm just going to make something up, put some characters on the page, and we'll see what happens. And by the end of the hour, I had like 6 or 7 pages and turned it in. And that was my journal assignment. And she came to me later and said, this is actually really interesting. I'm actually loving reading this. Like, do you want to do this when you grow up? And I said, what do you mean do this when I grow up? And she said, you can be an author, you can write books. And as soon as I found out that was a job, I was like, oh yes, sign me up. But it all started with that one journal assignment. And for the rest of my childhood, the blank page was where I turned to for a space where my thoughts wouldn't be policed, where I could ask whatever questions I wanted to, explore whatever topics I wanted to, and I wouldn't be judged for it or ridiculed or punished. And even to this day, it's where I go for my own personal therapy. I write a lot of stories involving topics related to pain, but I write them in such a way that I hope it's digestible and even fun. That's what Slave was supposed to be anyway. And there are a lot of bright and fun moments in The Cost of Knowing. So yeah, that was how my childhood shaped what I write today.
Thank you. Anyone else like to go next?
I grew up in Los Angeles, but we were able to spend some of my childhood summers in Cuba on the farm with my great uncle Dario, named for Ruben Dario, and with my grandmother, and my great grandmother was still alive at the time, and hundreds of cousins. And so I fell in love with Cuban culture, but also with tropical nature, because for me, being in Los Angeles was city life, and then out in the countryside, small town and farms in Cuba was an entirely different existence that just opened my eyes to nature. And for me, storytelling was always outdoors. My grandmother and great grandmother were wonderful storytellers, but I would make up poems as I walked to the rhythm of walking outdoors. And so I'm going to read a very short poem about what Ruben Dario described in his love of writing. And the same is true for me, that I would have rather, as a child, I would have sat under a tree writing rather than going indoors. My tree friends, the trunk of the jicaro is black, its leaves small and feathery, the gourds dry and useful, each one a big wingless bird shape that can be carved into a bowl or musical instrument. The pomegranate is beautiful too, with its gnarled wood and jewel-like fruit. When I sit down to read in the shade of tree friends, I see a row of hammocks and rocking chairs, but I prefer earth, the natural home of growing roots and rhymed verses.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
Lone or Jay?
Yeah. So I grew up in first it was Waterbury, Connecticut. And I lived there until I was 9. It was a time where, like, I think we were living in an apartment for, it was 5 people. Well, at first it was like a whole family and then 5 people. My own family. We didn't really have a lot growing up then. So I think it was really through my mom's sort of hard work that we were able to get what we got. Like, I was able to take piano lessons at a discounted price. I was able to take dance lessons with the Parks and Rec department. And I'm just so grateful for my mom to provide, my mom and dad to provide all of that for us. And I think that's where, I think one of the questions was how we experience storytelling. And I think those art forms were my original forms, where, dancing, I was a horrible dancer, but watching other people dance was as if I was seeing a story, seeing their movements so graceful, and the way that they would perform, all of their like energy, emotions were just so apparent. And then piano, I was able to take piano, and, the music itself, like every movement of like a piece is like an act in a story almost. So I was able to experience that. But then we moved to Cheshire, and that's where my life sort of stabilized. And that's where I think my love of reading kind of grew, because during that time, well, before it was stabilizing, I also was bullied too. And I sort of sought refuge in books, escaping into it and just feeling comforted by it and protected by it. So I think that's where like my love of reading had bloomed. But then at the same time, I was still very shy, I think from all the earlier years of being bullied, and just shy because my family is also huge. So I felt almost like I'm also the youngest too. So I guess that shows too, where I was really shy. But in high school was when I got that serious bug for writing, where I had this wonderful, wonderful teacher who unfortunately passed away. I was writing a love story. She's actually her character is named after her, Megumi Yamamoto, where she had really encouraged my writing. She would have these sessions called occasional papers, where it's not part of like it was not part of the curriculum, but it was more of focused on the students themselves, where whenever they had a feeling or were going through something or had a thought, they were able to write an essay that was just about them, about what they liked and loved, wanted to talk about. So these occasional papers were almost like a way to find your voice. And Ms. Yamamoto allowed all of her students to do that. And I think that was where I seriously, I was like, writing is a gift. It's also therapy, like Brittney said too. So yeah, Ms. Yamamoto, thank you to English teachers.
Let's see so I think in Wings of Ebony in particular, I'm finding that different parts of my childhood show up in different stories I write. I have 2 books in the Wings of Ebony duology, and then I have a middle grade title that is out this August. And then I have, other projects I'm working on. And what I'm finding is that different pieces of my childhood bleed into different facets of my stories. The common thread, though, is often family. That's a big part in the books. And I think that is influenced by sort of some of the experiences that I had as a kid that were very different from the other kids that I was around. So through about 5th grade, I attended a local private school, and just my life and my experiences, my race and ethnicity, just me, period, was different from 99.9% of everyone else at this school. I was there in a scholarship, and I was just always very aware of how different I was, how different my home life was, how different my things were, because they were all very wealthy and I wasn't at all. And so I feel like I spent a lot of that part of my life not appreciating how I was different. And as I have 3 children that are in that 1st to 4th grade age range, and there's so much like cognitive development around their awareness of who they are and like their sense of identity that they're forming. And I just feel like, to be really blunt, it was very traumatic to be in a space where like who you are and like the way you live and the things you do and the music you like, even the foods you eat, are like constantly othered and like not the norm. It makes you as a little kid begin to wonder, well, is there something wrong with me? Like, why don't I have the experiences they have? Is there something wrong with my family? And so I spent a lot of my elementary years wanting to be different, wanting to live in a different place, wanting to look different. I'll never forget my mom's tears when I came home and asked her when my eyes were going to turn blue. And she was like, oh, honey, that's not how that works. Like I was in therapy in 3rd. I've never actually admitted this out loud to any of my readers. So, okay, exclusive here. I was in therapy actually in 3rd grade because my mom was like, I am so concerned about the psychological impact of her going to this really great academic school. Like in every other way outside of academics, it is like awful for her and I don't know what to do. And so she took me to a therapist to talk to when I was 8 years old. And I would tell that teacher about like things I thought about myself and like things I thought about my friends. And eventually my mom pulled me out of the school because she was like, it doesn't matter how good this is academically, like it is destroying your sense of self. And because like, again, like when I had birthday parties, like none of the kids from school came because they weren't allowed to drive through my neighborhood. Like their parents didn't come in our area. when they had parties, it was rare I was invited. There were a few families who were very, very like kind, and like they would invite me for a sleepover, and like you could tell there was a genuineness behind their hospitality. But even as a little kid, it was more judgment than anything else. And so, but I loved my home life. Like I loved my grandpa and his like wild stories. I loved how my grandma could cook anything and never used a recipe. I loved how my house was always filled with music. I love the smells in my house. I love the noises outside of my house. I would go to bed and there would usually be music outside because my neighbors would have an entire stereo system on their front lawn and a couch and like a cooler. And like, that's what they would do at night. And like, that was fun to me. Like, I don't know, like my neighbors would dance in the street sometimes because that's just like who our community was. But I never saw that in a book, and I never saw it at school. So when I decided to write, which I resonate with that idea of Brittney, where you're like, wait, I can be an author? Like I didn't have that moment though until 2018, 2017, really, like when I read Dear Martin and The Hate You Give. And I was like, wait, y'all care what my life was like in the hood, like for real? Okay, I could do that. And so I really just allowed myself to like, I mean, between 5th grade and 2017, I did a lot of work internally and a lot of therapy and just like learning to love myself and really digging through all those wounds. But I decided when I actually started to type out a book that it was going to be a love letter to my community and unapologetic in its delivery and just like full of like the beauty and richness that I know of home. And it was going to center an inner city Black teen who was the hero of the story, who is the chosen one, who is magical. And so that's what I wrote. And I find that, I mean, getting Rue's story out was cathartic. I got to work through a lot of things as I wrote her story, but even in subsequent stories, like A Taste of Magic and my next series that I'm working on, I still see like pieces of myself bleeding onto those pages where I'm just like taking our power back and putting us in the center and telling these beautiful stories about us, because there's just so much beauty that I think is missing from shelves because there aren't enough stories about us on shelves.
Well, thank you all for sharing. I can definitely, each of you, understand and feel where you're coming from. So along the theme of diversity, how do you feel diverse books and exposing kids to all kinds of different cultures, families, places is important, regardless of whether they are the race that is represented in books or not? Margarita, would you like to start?
I just believe in the word inclusive, and inclusive means everybody. It means multicultural, it means all genders, all experiences, and it means global. I would love to see more books from other countries and books in translation too. I think that once you start drawing lines and banning books and saying no books about this subject, no books about that subject, the next step is arresting writers. That is what happens in Cuba. First books were banned, then the writers were arrested. Now the people who protest the arrest of writers, the protesters are arrested. It's a very small leap from being narrow-minded to being tyrannical. And the children deserve for all of us to have freedom of expression. The children deserve to have free reading time where they can walk into the library and choose what interests them off the shelves. And I'm very discouraged about the narrow-mindedness that doesn't want inclusivity and doesn't want multicultural and global books and accurate history that wants to perpetuate the stereotypes and false history that was written a long time ago. I'm discouraged because I'm of an age where I spent my teen years protesting these things I was in all the civil rights marches. I was in all the peace marches. I was in all the women's rights marches. And I just feel like I'm starting over, you know, back in the 60s. And it's like, can they really take that back? What we worked so hard?
Thank you for that. Thank you so much. Lone, what do you feel about the importance of diverse literature for our youth?
Yeah. I think diverse books really just open up your world. It opens up, because in reality, it's not just you in the world. I always think of like the people who are banning these books. They expect as if like they're just in this one bubble, right? Or it's like they're surrounded by mirrors and they're just looking for people who look like them or think like them, act like them. They're just looking at themselves. Isn't that so narcissistic or like so boring, I guess? That's how I feel, at least for you know, people who think that everyone should think like them. And that's, I think, what's happening with the book banning. I think diverse books, yeah, it reflects reality. I feel people these days need to really live in that reality, but yeah, it's just so sad that it's not happening for certain people.
Thank you. JL?
Yeah, I agree so much with it, what everybody has said. I think when you give a kid a book where they can see themselves, you affirm that they are human. You let them know, you acknowledge their humanity. And I feel like some people assume that that's a given. That is not a given when you're in this country as a person of color. You do not assume in any way that you are sort of the norm. That is not a default assumption for any people of color that I know or myself. And so I think when you give a kid, I think about the absence of those books that reflected my lived experiences as a kid and how that sowed seeds of like self-loathing, you know, as a very young child. And it was just very disheartening to my family. And I think, you know, it's somewhat better now because then there were very few books to give me. There wasn't YA really. So I jumped from like Goosebumps to Eric Jerome Dickey and like, you know, like adult books because there wasn't anything that I really connected to deeply. And I just think that when you don't have that experience, you're denying, like it's probably the fact that I'm a Cancer, so I'm over emotional and I am a mom, so I have 3 kids. Like these are little babies who are like fighting for this desire to like know who they are. And like to deny them that experience of like seeing how their life is validated in the pages of a book. I think it's just robbing them of awareness of who they are, appreciation for who they are. And I think it's stifling their understanding of who they can be in the future. I think it's aggressive and wrong, and it's just really sad. I do also think that it's important that not only Black kids read Wings of Ebony, for example. I think reading breeds empathy all around. And I think, you know, one of my really, really good friends, she's an author too, and we are critique partners. So we exchange each other's work before, like when it's still trash, when like wouldn't want anybody to see it. And, you know, we were just talking very candidly when she read Wings because she had never read a book like that before. And she told me, I never name her when I mention this because it's a private thing, but I'm going to tell you what she told me. She said, you know, Jess, I had never met a Black person in real life until I was 20. This is not someone that's like, was alive in the 60s. This is someone who's younger than me. She's in her 20s. And she lived her life that long without even seeing with her own eyeballs a Black person. And so she was just like, my kids will never have that experience. Like I have purposely, like the neighborhood we live in and the school that my kids go to is like intentionally diverse so that they don't live in this sort of like isolated bubble because they have no idea what anyone's experiences, like you're saying, Lone, are like outside of their own. And I think that's dangerous to be honest. So anyway, I think reading breeds empathy, and I think everybody needs to read everybody's stories. So I think we all benefit from that.
Thank you. Brittney?
I just agree with everything that's been said. You're all brilliant, and I agree with all of you. Yeah, so I mean, going back to my own personal childhood, my home was extremely strict. I was raised right-wing Republican. I was raised extremely religious. I was raised to hate a lot of different groups. And it wasn't until I graduated high school and went to college that I realized I had to learn for myself that, you know, just so many things I thought about so many different people were wrong. And that people are a lot more complicated than what I was raised to believe. It was the first time that I met just people from all different backgrounds. And that was when I realized the real world was so much different than what I had grown up in. And so I write for so many different teens, but especially the ones who are siloed in echo chambers for their childhood, wherever they are. And I absolutely think it's so dangerous to censor kids from reading about experiences besides their own. That's kind of how we get this superiority complex about what we believe, and we believe that what we believe is right and nothing else can, touch us. It doesn't prompt debate or healthy conversation. It prompts more, I'm right, you're wrong, and that's the end of it. So yeah, absolutely. Diverse stories are real stories. That's the whole point. And whatever comes of this fight against diversity and censorship, I will continue to write about real teens experiencing real problems in the real world, because I have a responsibility to my readers to do so.
Thank you all. You actually combined another question I was going to ask about censorship and banning of books. So we killed two birds with one stone. And this will probably be the last question. And it's, what do you hope readers, teens, and educators take away from reading your book? What do you hope we will take away from reading your book?
My entire body of work is dedicated to peace. I always hope that reader will find hope by the end of each story. I never write anything unless, even if it's a factual, historical story, I don't choose stories where I don't find hope. But my reason for writing about peace, and the word empathy was used, that's the key to peace, is that my family was divided from 1960 on, when travel restrictions made it easier for a US citizen to walk on the moon than to visit a grandmother in Cuba. And so every failure of peace efforts means divided families. And I wasn't able to go back to Cuba until 1991. It's still very complicated, but I have been going back since 91. There are so many conflicts all over the world, but the ones going on right now just remind me how desperately we need to find heroes of peace and see peace as a goal, instead of having all the history books and historical novels written about generals. I'd rather write about the child that, that needs their family, about the families, the real people.
Thank you for that. JL?
I think more than anything, I want readers and educators just to realize how incredibly capable, particularly Black kids are, particularly Black kids from inner city communities. I'm an inner city community kid, and I wouldn't be anything without my community. And so I just want the students reading, the readers reading my book to realize that they're powerful, because I think a lot of us question that for a long time. Can I be powerful? Am I powerful? Can I take up space? And I want Wings of Ebony to tell them emphatically, yes. It's not even a question. Now go forth and use your magic.
Thank you. Brittney?
So I guess the message across all of my books is that you always have someone you can go to. And specifically between Slay and the Cost of Knowing. For Slay, it's no one can tell you how to be who you are. Your identity is whatever you make it. And be empowered to be whoever you are and take as long as you need to figure out what that looks like. And in the Cost of Knowing is on the other side. If you are having trouble, if you feel like your world is too heavy to carry alone, ask for help, reach out, talk to people, express your feelings. And that I know it's hard, and especially as a person of color, and especially as a Black man or a Black boy, find your people, and your people may surprise you. It may not be who you expect.
Thank you. And Lone?
That was wonderfully said, Brittney. I think in my book, I think I want people to walk away with the idea that there's always time to grow. I think being human is there's never ending, it's a never ending process. So I think I want to tell teens that like who you are in high school is just the beginning. You have so many things ahead of you. I think another point I'd like them to walk away with is the past defines you, but also doesn't. I think Jess had said it well, like you wouldn't be here without where you had come from. And that's so powerful. In this book, I think my characters learn that despite what their family has said about each other, despite what had happened in the past, it doesn't define their relationship in the present. So in that way, I'm saying that their past, their family's past doesn't define them. So, and also on a fun level, I think I want people to just see Vietnamese food. Vietnamese people are cool. Vietnamese food is, honestly, I feel like if I could have like a store attached with my book or something associated with my book, that'd be great, because I really do want people to try every bit of Vietnamese food.
That's the second time you brought up food. I love food. Thank you. Well,
It's important.
we are at time. It is 7:58. We have 2 minutes. So I want to thank you all so much for sharing your story and your insight. It has just been wonderful. I was taking notes. There's lots of information I'm going to share tomorrow with my students and my colleagues. Again, we really appreciate you and all that you're doing. Continue to write, in prose, write your thriller, all that good stuff. So thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was lovely. So good seeing you all too.
Mhm.